Imagine a radio signal so powerful it could punch right through the Iron Curtain. Operating at 250,000 watts, 5 times the legal limit in the United States, XRF didn't just play rock and roll, it bypassed American regulations and bounced off the Earth's ionosphere. This skip allowed a gravelly voice from the Mexican desert to reach listeners as far away as Europe and the Soviet Union. But that massive transcontinental signal had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere was a place where domestic laws didn't exist. Deep in the lawless geography of Ciudad Acuña sat a fortified compound where disc jockeys broadcast under the protection of private security and Mexican federals. It was a concrete architecture designed to protect a high-voltage transmitter from the bandits and corrupt officials who constantly circled the station's wealth. Wolfman Jack himself had to maintain an armed encampment just to keep his boss soul power on the air. Yet, even a private army couldn't stop the visceral violence that was coming for the world's most powerful frequency. How did a Brooklyn delinquent build a transcontinental empire from the middle of a Mexican shootout? And why did the most powerful voice in radio have to end in a final, tragic silence? Robert Weston Smith didn't enter the world as a beast, but he certainly found his voice in a Brooklyn basement. Park Slope in 1938 stood as a neighborhood of Sunday schools and corporate stability, which fit the life of his father, the executive vice president of Financial World. Young Robert felt like a fundamental anomaly within that rigid system, drifting away from the professional path his parents envisioned. That friction took a turn when his father bought him a transoceanic radio, and the device acted as the ultimate catalyst for a different life. In the subterranean dark of his home, he discovered a hidden world of sound that bypassed the sanitized signals of the North. He studied the rhythmic jive talk of Philadelphia's Jocko Henderson and the howling madness of Alan Freed, spending years mimicking the vocal textures of these pipsqueak announcers. Graduation from the National Academy of Broadcasting came in 1960. The same year he debuted as Daddy Jules at WYOU. Playing race records for a black audience in Virginia felt like socio-political defiance, which meant he quickly became a target for local hate groups. Shortly after he married Lucy Lou Lamb in 1961, the Ku Klux Klan burned a cross on his lawn to protest his integrated dance club. When the station eventually forced him into the persona of Roger Gordon, he realized the American authorities could regulate the man, but they couldn't stop the physics of a signal located just across the border. Understanding the Wolfman requires a look at the physics of the border blaster, which operated on a battlefield of frequencies governed by strict laws. In the United States, the FCC maintained a hard ceiling of 50,000 watts to prevent signal overlap, but the Rio Grande offered a lucrative loophole. By moving a transmitter into Ciudad Acuña, Mexico, the regulatory system of the North simply evaporated. At the center of this geography sat the XERF transmitter, a technical monolith that installed the RCA BTH-250A in 1959. This superpower set utilized 66 massive vacuum tubes, and the result was a 250,000-watt megaphone that dwarfed every station in America. Smith claimed the signal carried such physical force that birds dropped dead when they flew too close to the tower. Nighttime conditions made the station even more powerful because of a shift in the Earth's ionosphere. The clear channel signal at 1570 kHz would hit this layer and skip across the entire continent, which meant a car driving from New York to LA would never lose the station. It bypassed the media establishment entirely, and that's when the gravelly howl became a shared experience from the Soviet Union to US troops at sea. This infrastructure of power grew from a foundation poured by a man who sold surgical fantasies to a desperate nation. The concrete bunker in the desert actually grew from a foundation of fraudulent virility. Dr. John Romulus Brinkley poured that concrete, and this marketing genius transformed the border into a sanctuary for medical scams. Brinkley earned his nickname as the Goat Gland Doctor by charging $750 to surgically implant slivers of animal testicles into human patients. He pioneered media politics at his Kansas station, KFKB, where he diagnosed listeners over the air through a medical question box. That empire faced a systemic strike in 1930 when the government revoked his license for promoting these surgeries. Brinkley viewed that defeat as a catalyst, and he established XER in Mexico to operate beyond the reach of Washington. James Weldon built a monster transmitter for the station by 1938, combining two 250,000-watt amplifiers to aim 1 million watts squarely at the United States. Congress passed the Brinkley Act in 1934 to cut off his phone lines, but the doctor simply began smuggling transcription discs across the border in his car. He created a legal loophole that allowed him to broadcast from the shadows, and when the Mexican government finally seized the site in 1941, they left behind a high-powered vacuum. The stage was set for a different kind of outlaw to take over the airwaves. Ciudad Acuña was less a radio station and more a fortified military outpost during the early 1960s. Success at XERF didn't just require a good playlist, it required a private security force to defend the 250,000-watt machine from bandits and corrupt officials. The persona of Wolfman Jack acted as a shield for Robert Weston Smith, but the physical reality involved an architecture of violence. Tension reached a breaking point in April of 1963 when armed men seized the station, and the result was a high-stakes standoff that only ended when federal troops arrived. The situation turned lethal in January of 1964 during a visceral gun battle that left a 50-year-old man dead. That blood price forced Smith to reconsider his physical presence in the desert, and he fled the border for the safety of Minneapolis. But here's the thing, the Wolfman didn't die when the man left the building. He became a ghost in the machine by recording his shows on tape and shipping them back to the border. This separation allowed him to keep his technical power while living in Hollywood, and what nobody expected was that this model would invent modern radio syndication. To keep that ghost alive, the station relied on a bizarre intersection of high-wattage faith and mail-order miracles. Wolfman Jack appeared to be the high priest of rock and roll, but his raspy odes to rhythm and blues actually lived on a foundation of Pentecostal money. The station sold its airtime between 7 and midnight to American evangelists who used the signal to harvest donations from isolated listeners. Figures like Reverend Ike and the millionaire Brother Al, who lived on a 60-foot yacht, transformed the 250,000-watt frequency into a marketplace for faith. They sold everything from blessed prayer cloths to a divine rejuvenation they called spunk. When the preachers finished their sets, the Wolfman pivoted into his own huckster role, selling 100 live baby chicks or a pill called Florex. He marketed that supplement to add zing to your ling nuts, and the money from these mail-order trinkets funded his entire musical revolution. This revenue model collapsed in January of 1971 when the Mexican government banned Pentecostal preachers from the airwaves. XERB lost 80% of its income overnight, which meant the financial infrastructure of the outlaw era had vanished. Smith had spent a decade as a voice without a face, but the end of the border money forced him into the light. A young filmmaker was about to pull him out of the shadows and turn him into a global star. Millions of people heard the gravelly growl of the Wolfman for 10 years without ever knowing what he looked like. That anonymity allowed listeners to project their own racial assumptions onto the voice, and Smith actively encouraged the belief that he was black to bridge the gap between race records and white audiences. But the 1971 revenue collapse forced him to take a job at KDWA in Los Angeles for a pittance of his former salary. His true shift toward immortality started in 1973 when George Lucas cast the Wolfman as himself in the film American Graffiti. Lucas had spent his youth tuned into that Mexican frequency, and the success of the movie finally put a face to the legend. It revealed a bearded professional dispensing wisdom in a lonely studio, which should have killed the mystery, but instead turned him into a brand. He used that momentum to launch the first national radio syndication system by editing his old XERB tapes. At his peak, the Wolfman reached over 2,000 stations in 53 countries, and he successfully turned his own ghost into a business empire. As the mainstream embraced the beast, the physical reality of being the Wolfman began to take a heavy toll. The transition to television required a level of energy that left very little room for the man beneath the beard. The visibility of the 1970s transformed a regional anomaly into a global media force. Robert Weston Smith finally synchronized his face with his voice on NBC's The Midnight Special, where he hosted live musical acts from 1973 to 1981. This was a strange shift for a man who once hid in a Mexican bunker, and now he stood as the connective tissue between the counterculture and the living rooms of Middle America. His reach felt systemic, and his 16-year tenure on Armed Forces Radio made him a constant companion for soldiers stationed around the world. But the animal persona required a high-frequency energy that became harder to maintain as he aged. Behind the manic eyes and the trademark beard, Smith struggled with a cocaine addiction and the physical exhaustion of his own mythology. Seeking a fundamental reset, he moved his family to a rural estate in Belvidere, North Carolina, in 1989. The rise of MTV threatened to turn the purely sonic power of the radio DJ into a relic of the past, and Smith knew his era was closing. He decided to write his autobiography, Have Mercy, and embarked on a grueling 20-day promotional tour. That tour acted as a final marathon, leading him toward a broadcast that ended in an uncharacteristic moment of silence. July of 1995 was a physical endurance test for a man who had already spent 30 years on the air. Robert Weston Smith navigated a relentless schedule of early morning interviews and flights across the country to promote his life story. When he reached Washington, D.C. for his final broadcast at Planet Hollywood on June 30th, the exhaustion had settled into his bones. He performed for 4 hours on 79 stations, fueling the Wolfman persona with coffee and unfiltered Camels. During that show, he told his audience that the best vibrations aren't on the radio, but in the heart where we keep the music when we don't hear it anymore. Colleagues noticed he seemed anxious to leave the studio, and his final professional words were a longing for his wife Lou. He boarded a flight to North Carolina the next morning and arrived at his home in Belvidere on July 1st. His manager, Lonnie Napier, said the end was nearly instant. Smith walked up his driveway and stepped inside to give his wife the hug he'd been talking about, but he collapsed and died of a heart attack the moment they touched. The 250,000-watt howl had transitioned into a permanent silence. His legacy moved from the desert transmitters into the digital archives, leaving a signal that refused to be switched off. Remastered recordings of the original Wolfman Jack shows began airing on XEPRS in 2024 to celebrate the station's 85th anniversary. This resurrection proved that the gravelly growl could bypass the death of the AM band and move into the digital age. The outlaw signal that once skipped off the ionosphere now lives on laser-engraved synthetic quartz, ensuring the howl outlasts the civilization that once tried to ban it. The transmitters in the Mexican desert sit as rusted hulks today, and the vacuum tubes are cold. But in the static of the digital midnight, you can still hear the vibration of a man who bridged the divide between segregated basements and global screens. He proved that a powerful frequency doesn't need a tower because it lives in the desire for a world without boundaries. Whether a man dies when his heart stops, or when the last listener stops tuning in remains the final mystery of the Wolfman.